It wasn't just fear that gripped the German shepherd. It was something deeper, something haunting. Emily had seen plenty of stray dogs before, but none quite like him. His body was frail, his ribs pressed tightly against his skin, yet he refused to eat a single bite of the food she offered. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. His eyes told a story of survival, of suffering, and perhaps something more. Emily felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just another lost dog. This was different. "Come on, buddy," she said softly, holding out another piece of food. "You need this." But the dog remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. It wasn't fear keeping him from eating. It was something else entirely. The air grew colder, the weight of the moment sinking deeper into her chest. Emily knelt down, trying to get a closer look. As she reached out, her fingers brushed against the dog's fur, revealing something hidden beneath, the faint outline of scars crisscrossing his thin body. Her breath caught in her throat. What happened to you? Her instincts kicked in. She couldn't leave him there, not like this. Wrapping her jacket around his trembling frame, she whispered, "We're going to figure this out. I promise." The drive to the vet was filled with silence, broken only by the occasional whimper from the back seat. Emily kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, her mind racing with questions. Why wouldn't he eat? Why was he covered in scars? And most importantly, had someone done this to him? When they arrived at the clinic, the vet's face darkened the moment he saw the dog. He ran his hand gently along the shepherd's side, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. "This isn't just starvation," the vet said, his voice low. "We'll need to run tests, but my gut tells me there's something much bigger going on here." Emily's heart sank. She had expected a stray in need of food and rest, but now it felt like she had just stepped into a mystery far more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. And as the vet carried the dog into the back room, Emily couldn't help but wonder, what was the truth behind those eyes? The room was silent except for the soft beeping of the monitor in the corner. With the vet in front of her, Emily's hands were shaking a bit as she scanned the table. Every second dragged heavier than the last. "He's really dehydrated," the vet said, gently examining the dog's vital signs. "And being malnourished, but it's beyond that. Look at this." He carefully raised a flap of hair around the dog's shoulder to reveal a deep scar, an old wound that hadn't healed properly. Anger and grief washed over Emily. Someone had hurt him badly, yet that wasn't the worst part. As the vet went on with his examination, he found several more old injuries, fractures that had knit on their own, resulting in slight misalignments of the dog's legs. There were indications of previous trauma to his ribs. Each scar on his body was a story of survival, but also unspeakable suffering. Emily swallowed hard. "How can anyone do this to him?" she whispered, so softly I could barely hear her. The vet shook his head, looking grim. "I have seen cases like this before. Dogs being used for illegal activities, made to fight, and worse things. Or, when they can no longer perform, they get abandoned, left to die." Emily's heart sank. She looked at the dog, who was still on the table, his eyes open again, staring up at her. The way he was looking at her had an almost haunting quality, as if he was silently communicating to her all the things the vet wasn't able to put into words. "I'm not going to let that happen to you. Not again." The vet reached out, a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can for him. But first, We need to do some blood work and get an X-ray. There could be more going on inside that we don't see just yet." Emily nodded, a look of determination hardening on her face. "Do whatever you need to do. I'm going to be here as long as it takes." Emily was left in the examination room while the vet took the dog back for the tests. Her imagination was on fire, attempting to reconstruct what was known. What kind of dog was he before he became a homeless mutt? What had his life been like? And why did he refuse to eat? Minutes felt like hours. Emily was pacing back and forth, the beat of her heart echoing in her chest. Each time the door opened, she lifted her head, expecting an update. But it was always just a passing technician or a fellow patient. Finally, the door opened, and in walked the vet. His face was grave, but there was more than that in his eyes, more than Emily could quite read. "We have the results," he said with a folder in his hand. "And I'm going to be honest with you, they're surprising." Emily's throat tightened around her breath. "What do you mean?" The vet paused briefly, then pressed on. "There are no indications of any illness or infection at this time. His organs are functioning normally, and nothing in his blood work indicates poisoning or disease." Emily blinked, struggling to process the news. "So, why won't he eat?" "That's the part that doesn't add up," the vet said. "Physically, there's not a reason for him to refuse food. It is not his body that is stopping him from eating. It is his mind. His mind." The statement lingered like a millstone in the air. Emily felt her pulse quicken. What kind of trauma could render a dog so shattered that he'd turn down the one thing he required to live? The vet went on, his voice now softer. "He's been through so much, Emily. He might connect food with something grievous, something the memory of which he's trying to escape." Emily nodded slowly, feeling the pieces fall into place. This wasn't like a dog that needed food and shelter. He was in pain, physically and emotionally. "We're just going to take it day by day," the vet said, "but it's going to require patience and a lot of love." Emily looked back at the dog, which was now lying wearily still. He had already endured so much. He had battled pain and hunger and fear. And now, it was her turn to battle for him. The results answered some questions, but raised even more for Emily. She got her eyes fixed on the German Shepherd, watching closely, curious to know the end of this complex story buried in the dog's tired eyes. He had overcome so much, but every fiber of his being told him to continue fighting, or perhaps to flee. Emily leaned in, speaking quietly. "Hey, big guy. I know you've had to weather a lot, but you're safe now. No one's ever going to hurt you again." The dog's ears twitched at her voice, but he stayed where he was. Even so, there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, a small spark of trust trying to pierce the layers of fear. The vet came back with a bowl of warm broth and placed it softly in front of the dog. "Let's try this," he said. "It's not heavy, and the smell could entice him." Emily had been holding her breath, praying for a miracle. His nose almost touched the surface of the bowl as the dog sniffed. For a moment, it sounded like he might relent, but then he retreated. Her heart sank. "It's okay," the vet said to her. "We're going to take it slow. This type of trauma doesn't go away in a week." However, as Emily began to answer, an unexpected thing occurred. The dog, as if sensing her discontent, leaned in again, licking the broth this time cautiously. Emily's eyes widened. "He's eating!" It was not much, just some little swallows, but it was a start, a breakthrough. The vet smiled. "That's a good sign. He's beginning to trust you. Sometimes that's all you need. One small step in the right direction. A wave of relief and hope washed over Emily. She knew that they had a long way to go still, but this tiny victory was everything. "You're stronger than you realize," she said, stroking the dog's head. "We will be figuring this out together." For the first time since she'd found him, the dog made a soft sigh and placed his head on her lap. It was a moment of outright vulnerability, an indication that he felt safe for the first time in a long time. But the ordeal was far from over. For the first time in their travels, Emily could see a glimmer of hope. The dog, whom she had begun calling Max, was improving. A few steps more, and he was beginning to trust her, if hesitantly and slowly. Every small step was a victory. But Emily also knew, deep down, that there was more to Max's story. Far more. That night, returning to her small apartment, she made a warm spot for Max next to the couch. She spread out a soft blanket, a bowl of fresh water, and some broth. The only thing he'd appeared willing to eat so far. "You're home now," she said, joining him on the floor. "No more cold streets, no more fear." Max gazed up at her, his eyes shining with gratitude and sadness. He stretched out across the blanket and sighed deeply. But as Emily was beginning to sink into relaxation, Max's body went taut. His ears pricked, and his eyes bore down on the front door. A low growl came from his throat, a sound Emily had never heard from him before. "What is it, Max?" she said, her heart fluttering. She looked at the door, but the hall outside was quiet and empty. Max's growl tempered, but he stayed on alert, his eyes still trained on the door. She reached over and rested a hand on the middle of his back and could feel the tension in his muscles. It was like he was remembering something he couldn't forget. Emily's thoughts raced. The scars, the refusal to eat, the state of heightened alertness. It was becoming more apparent by the moment. Max wasn't just a stray. He was fleeing something or someone. Some routine questions, but Emily's a determined darling and got out her phone to call the vet. "I need to know everything we can about his background," she said. "No way to trace where he came from? I believe somebody may have harmed him and might still be out there." The vet agreed to look for a microchip and to do further testing, but he cautioned her that answers might come slowly. "Be careful, Emily," he continued. "If Max was part of a dangerous situation, the person or people who abandoned him may not want him found." Emily tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm not going to let anything happen to him," she vowed. When the call was over, she settled back down beside Max, her head whirling. The mystery of him was deeper than she ever expected it to be. Max laid his head on her lap, his body relaxing for once. But one thing Emily knew was that his past wasn't done with him. Emily leaned forward, her heart racing. Max lay silently at her feet, his eyes watchful but relaxed, the opposite of the air in this room. Finally, the vet looked up, his face stern. "I scanned for a microchip," he said, holding up a file, "and we found something." Emily leaned forward. "A microchip? Does that mean we can discover where he came from?" The vet nodded slowly. "Yes, but there's where the thing is strange. The chip is registered to an address a few towns over, and it belongs to a place that hasn't been operated in years." Emily's stomach twisted. What kind of facility? The vet hesitated. A puppy mill. An unlicensed breeding operation. They were notorious for illegal activities, abusing dogs and overbreeding dogs, especially large breeds such as German Shepherds. When the authorities shut them down, many dogs were rescued, but some disappeared before they could be saved. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Max had gotten the hell out of that place. A whirlwind of questions raced through her mind. How long had he evaded authorities? What horrors had he seen? And why had no one been searching for him until now? Whoever was running that operation, they didn't care about these dogs, the vet said. It's possible that Max would not eat because of something that took place in there, something that he can't forget. Emily's hands balled into fists, fury simmering just below the calm. Her eyes fell on Max, watching her silently, as if he understood every word. "You've been through so much," she said softly. "But you no longer need to be afraid. You're safe now." The vet nodded. "The good news is Max is doing really well with the care you have given him. His health is improving. What you can do now is give him time and love to heal the scars you can't see." Emily inhaled deeply, resolve boiling up in her. "I will not allow anyone to hurt him anymore," she said firmly, "no matter what it takes." But just as she was getting up to walk out, the vet had one final caveat. If anyone had ties to that facility, they could still be out there and looking for dogs like Max. "Be careful, Emily. Not everyone wants these tales to have happy endings." Emily nodded her head, her mind racing as she walked out of the clinic. The low sun in the late afternoon cast long shadows on the street, but not reminders that their fight was unfinished. Max trotted beside her, his steps stronger than they had been earlier, but Emily couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching. She locked the door behind them when they arrived home, and sat down on the floor next to Max. With a steady, calm voice, she stroked his fur gently with her fingers. "We are going to get through this," she said. "We're in this together, no matter what's coming." Max laid his head on her knee and let his body relax. For the first time in days, he closed his eyes and fell into a calm sleep. But Emily recognized that this was mere calm before the storm. The past never stays buried for very long. For the first time in days, Emily did not get the sense that things were coming together. Max had eaten more than he normally did that day, and his energy was gradually coming back. His eyes appeared brighter, his steps surer. But even while attempting to concentrate on the vet's report, a gnawing sense of bloodlust crept into her breast. The earlier words repeated in her mind. "Be careful. Not everyone wants these stories to have happy endings." A gentle knock at the door brought her thoughts back. Emily glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m., way too late for a surprise guest. Her pulse quickened. "Who could that be?" she said, looking at Max. He was already alert, ears up, eyes on the door. The knock came again, louder this time. Emily's heart pounded as she rose and walked slowly toward the door. She looked through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or a delivery driver, but there was no one there. Her throat closed up, unable to breathe. She froze for a second, then waited, listened. The hallway was eerily quiet. She slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peering out down the empty hallway. Nothing, but as she glanced down, her stomach turned. On the doorstep sat a small piece of folded paper. When she picked it up, her hands shook and her eyes flicked back and forth, half expecting people to jump out at her from the shadows. She unfolded the note and saw barely legible words scribbled across the page. "You just should have left him where he was." Her breath hitched, and she locked the door, her heart racing. Max stepped nearer and picked up on her discomfort. His body was coiled, eyes darting across the room, as if looking for a non-existent danger. Emily pushed her back against the door, the note crumpled in her fist. Who had left it? How did they know about Max? Her thoughts raced through all of the possibilities, but the one thing she was sure of was they had been watched. And whoever was out there didn't want Max to get a second chance. But Emily didn't intend to quit. She glanced down at Max, standing guard beside her, eyes keen as well as unflinching. "We are not running," she said evenly, her tone solid, though fear surged through her. "We've come too far for that. They'll have to go through me first." Max seemed to understand. He leaned his head into her leg, a vow without words that whatever was coming, they would do it together. The apartment went quiet again, but the tension remained. The note still in her hand, Emily sat down next to Max, her mind racing with the plan she was going to put into action. She was no longer just protecting Max. This was a battle she wasn't going to lose. Emily hadn't slept at all. Her mind replayed the events of the previous night over and over. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside was her heart racing. "Good boy," she said, glancing at Max, who remained tense, his ears perking up at the slightest sound. He felt it as well. The threat that was nearing. The note on the table was downright surreal. It was a message, a warning, but more than that. It was a threat. Whoever had left it knew Max, and they wanted him back. Emily picked up her phone and called Claire, the vet's contact who had helped her track Max's history. Her voice was calm, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "Claire, so last night happened," she said. "Somebody put a note on my doorstep. They know about Max. They said I should have left him where he was." There was a moment of silence as Claire let the implication sink in. "There's no coincidence in that," she said at last. "If someone took the time to track you down and leave a message, that means they mean business. We need to act fast." "What do we do?" Emily demanded, gripping the phone tighter. "I'll reach out to the authorities and advocate for them to investigate Max's history," Claire vowed. "In the interim, you need to be vigilant. Lock the doors and don't go anywhere without informing someone. I'll go as soon as I can." Emily nodded, resolve hardening. "Thank you. I'm not going to let anybody take him from me." When she got off, she turned to Max. He watched her intently, the tension still in his body, the same fierce protectiveness in his eyes that she felt for him. "You're safe here," she said, squatting next to him. "Nobody's going to hurt you again, ever." "I'll make sure of that." Max pressed against her, his body giving in just a little. But even as those words slipped from her lips, Emily knew it wasn't over. Not even close. That afternoon, Emily took Max for a short walk around the block to wear off some of the stress. The streets were quiet, the crackling autumn leaves underfoot. For an instant, it seemed almost normal. But just as they turned a corner, Emily spotted something, or rather, someone, standing on the edge of the street half obscured by a tree. The figure didn't move. Her heart stopped. Was it a coincidence, or was this the same person? Emily's instincts kicked in. She gripped Max's leash tighter and headed back toward home, her pulse racing with each step. Max felt her anxiety, moving closer, attention creeping back into his body. Emily locked the door behind her when they got to the apartment and closed the curtains. She gasped, adrenaline pumping through her body. She pressed back against the door, thinking tidal thoughts. Who were they? What did they want? Ominously, one thing was clear. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching anymore. They were getting closer, and she couldn't stand to wait for them to act next. It was time to fight back. Emily typed furiously, looking for anything tied to the unlicensed breeding facility the vet had referred to. The further she dug, the darker the story grew. News articles painted grisly scenes, dogs held in tiny cages, underfed and abused, and placed into risky situations. The place had been shut by the authorities, but the owners had disappeared without a trace. Her heart sank when she looked at pictures of the rescued dogs. They were all so many, like Max, German shepherds with Max's haunted eyes and scarred bodies. But none of the articles referenced him. Where had Max been all that time? At that moment, her phone dinged with a message from Claire. "I've got news. Found a lead. Can I call you?" Emily didn't hesitate. She called Claire right away. "Emily," Claire said seriously, "I contacted someone who had worked on the investigation. He recalls a German shepherd that fit Max's description. One of the dogs they never recovered when the facility was raided." Emily's throat tightened as if in a chokehold. "You mean Max escaped?" "Yes," Claire confirmed. "But there's more." "Well, apparently, Max wasn't just any dog. He belonged to a special breeding line, one that was of immense value to the people running that operation. If they knew he was still alive, they'd do anything to recover him." Emily's stomach twisted. That is why they wrote the note. They weren't only trying to frighten her, they wanted Max back. Claire continued, her voice calm but urgent. "I've warned the authorities, but you have to be super careful. Watch for anyone suspicious. Keep Max in your sights at all times." Emily looked resolute as she nodded. "Thank you, Claire. We'll be ready." She hung up and turned to Max, who was staring at her without a word, his eyes twinkling with unremarked comprehension. "It's all right, Max," she said gently. "We're not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." She got up and walked to the front door, checking the locks one more time before drawing the curtains closed. The past few days pressed against the air pockets of the walls, creating a claustrophobia in the apartment. Max suddenly stood up, ears perked, body tense. He stepped to the window and stared at something outside. Emily's pulse quickened. She took out her phone and opened the live security feed. At first, she saw nothing, only the barren street lit in the yellow glow of the streetlights. But then, movement. A shadow passed between two parked cars and lingered there a moment only to melt into the darkness. That tightened her hands on the phone. Whoever they were, they had come back. Max growled softly, standing protectively in front of Emily. "We're ready for them," she murmured, her voice steady. "Let them try." The weight of fear pressed down on the room like a blanket, but under it was something different, resolve. Emily was no longer only defending Max. They were in this together now, and she was prepared to fight. Emily understood it was just a matter of time before they were at it again. That shadow she had seen the night before was no coincidence. They were watching, biding their time for the right moment. This time, she wouldn't passively allow them to intimidate her. She had a plan. Emily took her phone and called Claire. "I'm not waiting on them to make the next step," she said, her voice firm. "We're setting a trap." Claire paused for a second. "Is that really a good idea?" "I'm sure," Emily replied. "If they're watching the house, they're going to come back. We need to nab them red-handed." After a short discussion, Claire agreed. She would call the cops, tell them to keep an eye out while Emily put her plan into action. Later that night, the apartment was dim and the curtains were drawn, with light only from a single lamp in the far corner. Emily was in the living room and kept her phone in hand, provided she had to activate the security alarm in an instant. Next to her, Max was seated, eyes trained on the front door. His body wound like a spring. He could feel it. Something was coming. Hours ticked by, the silence growing heavier by the minute. Emily struggled to control her nerves, her heart racing in her chest. But then, just after midnight, the security camera came to life. Motion detected. Front door. Emily's gaze darted to the screen. A silhouette lingered just outside the door, obscured by shadows. This time, they weren't fleeing or hiding. They were frozen there, waiting. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her phone, setting off the alarm. A loud, screeching siren blasted, breaking the silence. The figure hesitated for a brief moment, then jetted into the street. Emily caught a glimpse of a shadow outside the window. "I got you," she said, a fierce fire lighting up her eyes. She grabbed Max's leash and opened the door, going outside. No one was on the street, but urgent footfalls rang through the alley. Claire's car arrived the same instant that Emily hit the sidewalk. "Did you see them?" Claire asked, stepping out. Emily nodded. "They ran down that alley." Claire signaled for the officers behind her to follow. "We'll catch them. Stay here with Max." Emily remained on the sidewalk, her breath fogging in the cold night air. Max pressed her leg, his eyes probing the shadows. A few moments later, one of the officers returned, his radio crackling. "We found him," he said. "He's in custody." Emily exhaled, a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She felt a wash of relief, but it was fleeting. She knew this wasn't only about catching one person. Whoever had sent him was still out there. Claire walked back over, her face serious. "This is just the start," she said. "The person we caught, he's just a piece of a larger overall problem, but we're going to get to the bottom of it." Emily nodded, more resolute than ever. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." She kneels next to Max, hand on his head. "We've got each other. That's all we need." Max leaned into her and looked at her with trust and strength. But as they turned to go in, Emily knew one thing for certain. This battle wasn't done yet. Emily clutched the armrest of her chair, her heart racing in her chest. A lifetime of unanswered questions, and now she was finally on the cusp of answers. The officer entered and closed the file in his hand, letting out a sigh. "We've got him identified," he said, looking from Claire to Emily. "His name is Martin Hale. He worked at the breeding facility we have been investigating. When the operation was closed, he vanished, until now." Emily's blood ran cold. He had been monitoring them all along. "But here's the thing," the officer said. "He's not simply some former employee. He managed the highest value dogs in the operation, according to the records we found. If Max is one of those dogs, then it would explain why he's so hell-bent on getting him back." Emily looked at Claire, her brain scrabbling. Max wasn't merely a victim of neglect. He was the linchpin to something much more diabolical. "What does he want with Max now?" "Why?" Emily asked, her voice even but trembling with fear. The officer hesitated. "We're not quite sure, but they are worth a lot of money in illegal circles," said Max's partner. "Breeding, fighting, even underground auctions. If he knows Max survived, he could view him as a means to rebuild what was lost to him." Emily clenched her fists. "That's not going to happen. Max is not a prize. He's not going back to that life, not on my watch." With one comforting hand on Emily's shoulder, Claire said, "We won't let that happen. We'll do whatever it takes to protect Max." That night, at Emily's apartment again, Emily sat on the floor next to Max and stroked his fur. His eyes were peaceful but alert as he never lost sight of what turmoil was happening around him. "You've gone through so much," she said, whispering, "but you're safe now. We'll do whatever is next together." Max gave her hand a gentle lick, as if to say he understood. He had struggled so long, first for survival, then for freedom. Now, with Emily around him, he was beginning to believe he could have a future without fear. But Emily was well aware this wasn't the end. Not yet. Martin Hale could be in custody, but there were still too many dangling questions, too many puzzle pieces that didn't fit. Her phone buzzed, bringing her back to reality. It was a text from Claire. "This is broader than we understood. Tomorrow I will explain it all. Stay alert." Emily's heart sank. When she finally thought she had some peace, another storm approached. She locked the doors, surveyed the security feed one last time, then curled up next to Max on the couch. It was done, the apartment silent, and yet the unspoken words still hung in the air. The battle wasn't finished, not yet. But this time, Emily was ready for it. Whatever happened next, she and Max would face it together. Emily's mind was whirling with possibilities. What could Claire have found out that was worse than what they all already knew? How much deeper did this go? She was jolted from her reverie by a knock at the door. She stood up, heart quickening, opened it, to find Claire standing there with a thick folder in her hand, her face uncharacteristically somber. "We need to talk," Claire said as she walked in, her gaze glancing at Max before turning to Emily. Emily gestured for her to follow into the kitchen. "What did you find?" She laid the folder on the table and flipped it open. The folder contained papers and photographs. "I did a little more digging on the breeding facility and Martin Hale's involvement in it," she wrote. "But the operation turned out not only to be about breeding and selling dogs. It was only a small part of a much bigger network, one that traded in illegal dog fights and underground sales of special breeds." Emily's throat tightened as if being choked. "Special breeds?" Claire nodded grimly. "Max was one of those dogs. According to these records, he was part of a genetic experiment to produce the perfect German Shepherd. Better, stronger, faster, tougher. To them, he was an investment, not a living buying. They lost millions in potential profit." Emily looked down at Max, her stomach twisting. He wasn't merely a victim of neglect, he was prey. So, when they found out he was still alive, Emily trailed off, the gravity of the situation settling on her. Claire had already completed the thought for her. They wanted him back, badly. If Max had fallen into the wrong hands, they would have used him to restart everything they lost. Emily's fists balled up, and anger simmered underneath. That's not going to happen. Max is not a tool. He's not a thing to own or sell. He's family. Claire flashed her a reassuring nod. "The good news is, with Martin Hale in custody, the authorities now have sufficient evidence to put an end to the remnants of this operation once and for all. But it won't happen overnight. Until then, you have to be on your toes." Emily took a breath and felt her determination grow. "We have come too far to turn back now. Whatever it takes, we are going to protect him." The apartment was peculiarly quiet, but Emily still had the sensation that they were being watched somewhere. She made sure the locks were engaged and the security cameras were armed, her eyes darting to each shadow outside. Max was lying quietly next to her, breathing easy and slow. He had the sense that things were shifting, that the threat was gradually receding. Emily knelt beside him, gently resting a hand on his head. "You're safe, Max," she said in a whisper. "No one is ever going to take you away again." Max leaned into her fingers, trust pooling in those forest green eyes, trust that had been so long in the making, yet now felt like the china doll that had fallen and shattered, mended with glue. The phone buzzed again, a message from Claire flashing across the screen. "We're very close to shutting them down for good. Stay strong." Emily beamed, her heart swelling with bittersweet triumph. She knew the battle wasn't finished, but for the first time it felt like they were winning. "We have this," she said quietly. "Together." Max let out a low whine of approval and curled up next to her. And in the now empty plight of the apartment, which was slowly turning to silence, she knew one thing deeply, solidly. They were prepared for whatever came next. Emily felt like she had been holding her breath for days. What she learned last week about Max's past rocked her, but it also fortified her. They were so close to putting this nightmare behind once and for all. Her phone buzzed. It was Claire. "The operation goes down tomorrow. Law enforcement will raid the last active site linked to the network. After that, it'll be over." Emily felt her heart swell with relief. One more day, and Max would be safe. But for all her attempts to unwind, an odd tension took root in her chest. Something wasn't right. It felt too quiet, too calm. Suddenly, Max's ears perked. He got up, tense, a low growling coming from his throat. He drifted toward the window, staring intently at something beyond. Emily picked up her phone and looked at the security feed. For a moment, all seemed normal. The street was clear, the soft hum of the night in the air. Then she saw it, a shape that hung in the dark, just a foot outside the halo of the street lights. Her pulse quickened. Not again. She pressed record on the security app, which would document every movement. This time, the figure did not approach the house. Instead, they stood quietly, watching, waiting. Max gave another growl, this time a much louder warning sound, positioning himself closer to Emily as she lay huddled at his feet. Emily gritted her teeth, fear hardening into resolve. She got her cell phone and called Claire. "They're here," she said, her voice steady but strong. "They're watching again." Claire didn't hesitate. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. I'm sending somebody over immediately." Emily hung up, then locked every door and window in the apartment. She snatched the small canister of pepper spray that she kept by the door, her heart pounding. Max remained at her side, keeping his eyes on the front door. As they waited, minutes felt like hours. At last, headlights appeared in the distance, and two officers emerged from a black SUV. She opened the door. Her breath released at last. "They're gone," one of the officers said as he scanned the area. "But we will remain here for the night, just in case." Emily nodded, and her hands were shaking a little. "Thank you." As the officers went outside, Emily sat back down on the couch, Max settling down beside her. She petted his fur, voice steady as the chaos swirled around her. "It is almost over," she whispered. "We just have to get through one more night." Max laid his head on her lap, eyes shutting for the first time in hours. And yet Emily felt a strange peace. Whatever might happen next, they were as ready as could be. The next morning, the sun rose lazily, filling the apartment with warm light. The evening before seemed so long ago. Emily looked at her phone. No new messages from Claire. For the first time in weeks, she dared to believe they had won. But while she was in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. "It's done. The raid was a success. They've closed the last store, and Martin Hale isn't getting out anytime soon. You're safe now." Emily's knees almost gave out with relief. She knelt next to Max, putting her arms around him. "We did it," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "It's finally over." Max gave a light lick across her face, and his tail wagged for the first time in what felt like ages. For the first time since the day she found him, Emily was free. Her long-borne weight was gone, but more than that, she was a reminder that Max wasn't just the dog she'd saved. He was family. For the first time in what seemed like years, Emily let herself breathe. The pressure on her chest had lifted, at least temporarily. The threat that had hung over them for weeks appeared to be dissipating. Claire's message was still on her mind. "We've taken down the network. Martin Hale is not going to be a problem anymore." But one part of her couldn't completely relax. Was it really over? Or was there something lurking in the dark? Max roused, his ears perking as he raised his head. His gaze swept across the room and returned to Emily. His body language was relaxed, serene even. Emily put the bowl of warm food in front of him, smiling. "Here you go, Max. You've earned it." Max sniffed the bowl and then had a few cautious bites. It was still a gradual process, but he was eating more day by day. "You're tougher than ever," Emily said quietly, crouching next to him. "I knew you could do it." Emily was sitting on the couch and scrolling through her phone. She could feel the tension of past weeks evaporating. Out there, the street was quiet, illuminated by the soft light of the streetlights. But then, Max tensed again. His ears perked, and a low growl rose in his chest. Emily's heart stopped. Not again. She picked up her phone and opened the security feed. At first, it was all normal, an empty street, the gentle hiss of the night. But then she noticed a silhouette lurking just outside the light, half visible in the shadows. She caught her breath in her throat. Someone was back. Max bent close to her, his body coiled and poised. Emily's heart raced as she pressed record on the security app, filming the figure's movements. The figure lingered briefly, then retreated into the shadows. Emily waited and waited, her heart racing, but they did not return. Claire's tone was steady, though serious. "Stay inside and lock everything up. Whoever it is, they're likely doing some testing to see if you let your guard down. I'll call the officers and tell them to patrol the area again." Emily nodded. "I won't let them take him. We're not running." "You're stronger than you realize," Claire said. "You've made it this far. You're very close to the finish line." Emily ended the call and looked at Max, who stood guarding the door. He had struggled so strenuously to live, and now it was her turn to fight for him. "I told you I'd keep you safe," she said quietly, "and I don't break promises." Max released a small puff, his body relaxing ever so slightly. The silence returned to the apartment, but the tension remained, wrought and heavy. Emily perched on the couch, thoughts already whirring into plans. She knew this was not yet over. Whoever was out there wasn't going to just waltz away. But one thing was for sure. When they returned, she'd be prepared. The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily's gaze darted between the front door and the illuminated screen of her phone. With every tick of the second hand, time grew weightier, every sound beyond her window filled with sinister portent. She sensed it. Something was coming. Suddenly, Max growled. His ears perked up, his body going into full alert. Emily's heart jumped. She looked again at the security feed. For a split second, there was silence. Just the deserted street outside. Then the figure appeared again, moving quickly along the side of the house, staying just out of the light. Emily's pulse quickened. This was no random passerby. This was deliberate. Without thinking, she smashed the panic option on her security app, setting off the house alarm. Max reared up into a defensive position as a deafening siren cut through the quiet. The figure froze, looking toward the street, then darted into the shadows. Emily picked up her phone and dialed Claire. "They're back," she said, her voice firm despite adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I activated the alarm and they fled, but they will return. I know it." Claire's response was swift. "Stay inside. I'm sending officers down to you. We'll catch them this time." Emily locked the doors and windows once again, checking, rechecking. She was shaking, hands trembling, yes, but oh, her will. She wasn't going to be afraid. Bright lights from police cars illuminated the street as two officers emerged from them and turned their flashlights around the area. Max remained at Emily's feet, his gaze fixed on the front door. One of the officers came up to her. "We've increased patrols in the area," he said. "If they return, we'll be prepared." Emily nodded. "Thank you. I just want this to be over." Emily sighed with relief while still feeling this pang of anticipation as the officers set up their positions outside. This was the moment they had been preparing for at long last, the final test. Emily was sitting on the couch, completely worn out, yet resolved not to fall asleep. Max was curled up next to her, body relaxed but ready to jump into action at a moment's notice. Just as her eyelids began to droop, the security feed flared to life again. This time, the figure didn't hang in the shadows. They approached straight for the front door. Emily swallowed hard, unable to breathe. The figure loomed, an otherworldly aura around them, their features obscured in shadow. Then they raised one hand and knocked, once, twice, 3 times. Max leapt to his feet, a low growl emanating from deep within his chest. Emily hovered her fingers over her phone as if about to call for backup. But before she could go, a familiar voice called from the other side of the door. "Emily, it's Claire. Open up." Emily ran to the door, unlocked it, and ushered Claire in, her face blotched with cider, urgency in her eyes. "They found him," Claire said, panting. "The man we've been watching. He got away from the officers, but we were able to track him down. He's in custody now." Emily sighed shakily, and the burden on her chest had begun to dissipate. "It's over?" Claire nodded, her face softening. "It's over." Emily glanced back down at Max, who had finally relaxed after a few hours. His tail wagged a little, as if detecting the change of air. "You're safe now, Max," Emily whispered, kneeling next to him. "For good this time." They faced the sheets, which lay gracefully covered in the dim light of the study. For the first time in what seemed like forever, it felt calm. The nightmare was over. She crouched down beside Max, her voice soft, yet heavy with emotion. "We did it, buddy. We made it." Max licked her hand, gazing up at her with trust and devotion. For the first time in the weeks, Emily allowed herself to relax. No more late-night knocks, no more shadows lurking outside. Max was safe, truly safe. She glanced down at him, marveling at how far they had come. The fragile, terrified dog she had found on the street was gone. In his place was a strong, confident dog who had defied the odds, who had found his way back to life. "You're a survivor, Max," Emily said softly, running her hand through his thick fur. "And you're home. Forever." Max stirred, opening his eyes and gazing up at her with a calm, trusting expression. His tail wagged slowly, a silent affirmation of everything they had been through together, from the cold, empty street to the warm, safe apartment, from the moments of fear to the tiny victories. His first meal, his first restful sleep, his first steps into the world without fear. Emily stood up, grabbing Max's leash. "Come on, buddy," she said with a smile. "It's a beautiful day. Let's go explore it together." The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world felt wide open, full of possibilities. Max walked beside her, his head held high, his steps confident. Neighbors smiled as they passed, greeting Max with friendly waves. No one would have guessed the story behind those eyes, the battles he had fought and won. Emily looked down at him, her heart swelling with pride. "You've come so far, Max. This is just the beginning." Max barked softly, his tail wagging in agreement. Not every journey is easy. Some are filled with unexpected challenges, dark moments, and battles we never saw coming. But if Max's story has taught me anything, it's this. No matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change a life forever. And sometimes, the life that changes is your own. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you believe in second chances, resilience, and the power of love, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like Max's.